Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for our midweek Hebrew word study. We are continuing in the book of Daniel, and we're in chapter 7. And again, as I study and prepare for this, I sometimes mostly feel overwhelmed by um, just how interesting and mystical this is, and how there are so many facets to this that I certainly do not feel like I'm really going to be getting all of the I don't know, understanding. It's really challenging to know how to go through this and how much to glean, because there are many books written out there by many scholars who have dissected this, who have looked at it from Christian viewpoints, from non-Christian viewpoints, and I definitely don't want to spend all of that time um, sharing all of that information, because it's just overwhelming in some ways. But what I'm hoping to find through this is to compare it from maybe how the Hebrew scholars teach it, and then point out the things that we can see by looking at the language that's here. And of course, this chapter 7 is still in Aramaic, which is a sister language to Hebrew, has things that bring out questions. And one of those I want to go back to from what we looked at last week. Um, and it's in verse 5. And this bothered me after the class was ended, that I just felt like I didn't get a good understanding. And it has to do with this image of the bear who had three ribs in his mouth. And if you remember last week, I showed some images of what artists had rendered of what this could have looked like. And when we looked at that word for rib in the Aramaic, it is this word ayin, lamed, ayin, and then the yod and the nun safit, and it's pronounced Allah, which is an understanding that of something that goes up or that arises and lifts up. And as I mentioned last week, it's normally associated with offering of sacrifices and the smoke that ascends or allows up into the heavens. And so during this week, it was just coming back to me that could there be any um, connection there? Because the word rib is not really translated clearly. It seems to be just a more simple understanding. And I'm wondering, is there something deeper? And what occurred to me is to look ahead into the book of Daniel, and we go to Daniel chapter 10, and we go into verse 12. And I'm just showing the English here for right now, just to get a concept of where my mind was going. And this is a place where Daniel was relaying that he was trying to pray, and things weren't happening. And it was revealed to him by this angel, and said to him in verse 12 of chapter 10, said, "Fear not, Daniel, from the very first day that you set your heart to understand and to chasten yourself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words." So these words are understood in my thoughts anyway, that these were prayers that he was praying, because they were words being understood by the heavenly realm, by the angel, by God. These words were heard, and I've come for these words. But then he explains in verse 13, but that the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. So there was a challenging, a standing in the way here, a hindering of Daniel's prayers, that he couldn't answer until Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help against this king of Persia. Well, the king of Persia is referenced as a bear. So if we look down here, that a symbol of the Persian Empire is a bear. So I don't know, just felt that maybe a possible understanding here is that Daniel's prayers were being hindered by this bear, by the Prince of Persia, by the spirit, if you will, as we'll find out later, some understand to be a spirit uh, of the of the Persian Empire that was like a bear and held back or prevented Daniel's prayers from going forth, from going up. And so I felt much better about that understanding because that seemed to be somewhat supported in the later text. So I just wanted to bring that out here. So as we continue we read verse 6 last week, but we continue in verse 7. There's some really interesting things here. Daniel has this vision in the night, and he saw a fourth beast, dreadful, terrible, exceedingly strong, had great iron teeth, and it devoured and broke into pieces. Again, as he tries to explain, I can't even imagine what this dream was going to be like. The beast, it was different from the beasts that were before. It had 10 horns. He considered the horns, and there came up from among them another little horn, and three of the horns were plucked up by the roots, and another horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So again, very strange. And again, there's nothing in here in the Aramaic language that stood out to me of trying to find any deeper meaning, anything that's different. We'll find out later that Daniel does offer an explanation of this, and I think it's good just to let it take its course as we continue as Daniel goes on to explain in the next chapter. But what really intrigued me was in verse 9, and here in his vision, he saw thrones were placed. And this is interesting to me because all of my previous teaching, and everywhere that I have read, there is one throne in heaven. But Daniel is seeing more than one throne. And then we look at who is coming to sit on that throne and how is that entity, person, spirit, again, I don't even know what is the right word to use. How is Daniel describing what he sees? And so this is where it gets pretty fascinating. And there's some interesting words in here that I think to me were worth just looking at. And so he said he saw thrones that were placed. Doesn't say how many, doesn't say, we know there's more than one. So what is this all about? What is he seeing? He saw that there was one that was the Ancient of Days sat in the throne. So again, metaphors, words to describe a being that, traditionally we think of the Ancient of Days as God. So his description goes on that his raiment was white like snow. The hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. The wheels were burning with fire. A fiery stream came out from before him. Just like, wow. And I, of course, have seen imagery of non-Christian writers who say, oh, this is like a spaceship, and the wheels burning with fire and these fiery streams coming out were like what we would think of jet streams of fighter jets and the flames coming out the end. And they use understanding that we have today of modern machinery and try to apply it to this description here, and you'll find fantastic fantastical things, if that's a word, amazing things, fanciful things, I guess is the word I'm looking for, fanciful descriptions of this. And I don't know that we can gain any real good understanding in a biblical realm from them, because remember, in searching the scriptures, what's our focus? What are we trying to do? And for me, it's trying to get a better understanding of who God is, and more importantly, how he relates to us and how we can relate back to him. And what is the message here that is supposed to help me draw closer to God? Um, Gaining knowledge is one thing, and that's all wonderful. But if that knowledge, at least in my pursuit here, doesn't bring me closer to God, it really hasn't accomplished anything of eternal or lasting significance or enhancement in my life that helps make me a better person, helps me be part of the kingdom of God that I feel I need to fit in. So that's just a quick synopsis of where my mind goes at when I look at these, to look for those qualities that will bring a benefit in those areas of my life that I'm hoping to improve upon. So I want to know, who is this Ancient of Days? What are these characteristics about him? What could have been, going on here that Daniel saw? So we look down and we look at the Jewish sages here, what they would have to say on this concept of thrones. Remember, the Jews are very monotheistic. They set the guidelines, they set the standard for monotheism, which Christianity then grew out of. Christianity is also monotheistic. So, how do they address this term of thrones? They will look at it here as a judicial bench. They're looking at this of heavenly assessors acting in the name of a supreme judge. Um, this I didn't know before until I read this, that some in the Jewish realm hold to that there were two thrones, one for God and the other for the Messiah. So that's very interesting to see this. This is a Jewish source book. This is not Christian in any way. It's a Jewish source book that's saying that there were two thrones. Um, what I like about the Jewish commentators is they provide alternate opinions. Very seldom do you find that in Christian writings. Christian writings will say, well, here's what this group teaches, or here's what this person believes, and they won't include the other um, other opinions or viewpoints, but Judaism does that. And I like that. It allows us to prayerfully and with God's direction, try to come to our own understanding. And so here they include that others say that these assessors are the angels who recorded the events in the heavenly books. Then it goes on to talk about the person or the entity, Ancient of Days. I find challenging to describe it as a person because my understanding biblically of a person is who we are. We are people. Um, Divinity is, for me, challenging to describe as a person because it's in the spirit realm. It's in a physical realm that's so different than ours. And while we have entities that are and properties that are given to us by God that are obviously, as we're created in His image, um, we find throughout most of the scriptures the idea of a person is only attested to in those that are here on the earth, not those that are in a spiritual realm. So at least in the Hebrew writing, they don't attest to this um, being as a person, and they call him the first and the last, which again is very interesting. We see that attested to in Isaiah. We see Jesus also making this claim in the New Testament. Then a description of his garments, like snow, of purity, and then the other one of pure wool. So this is very interesting. It talks about the wheels and the flames and the comparison here to these wheels as in Ezekiel's vision. The book of Ezekiel is also another incredibly fanciful and fantastic read of the symbolism and of the imagery that he has experienced. Again, quite something to read that. We also see about the term used for those that are around about him. So we know that there are thousands of thousands. This is a metaphor used in biblical language because they did not have numerical understanding the way we do. They have the word for 1,000, and that's it. They did, so if you wanted more than 1,000, you would say thousands of thousands. And it doesn't really intend to give us the understanding of a certain number, like we would multiply 1,000 times 1,000 in our calculators, come up with a number and say, well, that's how many there were because the Bible says so. Well, this is not that type of language. This is poetic language. This is written for an understanding of a relationship being formed, not of a scientific formula or a mathematical formula to calculate. And then finally, this segment that we're going to stop at talks about obviously judgment was occurring, is how Daniel perceived this, and books were opened. Well, this is very interesting to understand that there are books. So let's go down and see what the Jewish sages say. Of course, we've heard this teaching before that, that there are books where things are written. Sometimes people will say, well, all the good things were done, that we do are written in a book. All the bad things we do are written in a book. We will see later on in the book of Revelation, when you read that there are books where all the things that a person does in their life is written down. We understand through the revelation of Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection, and the blood that was shed, that the sins that were recorded for us are forgiven and cleaned and wiped away, and that those sins that we committed were washed away. And so those portions of the book, as we understand from the book of Revelation, are eliminated and we are pardoned. So to see this idea of the books being talked about by the Jewish sages in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament gives us a foundation for what we read about in the book of Revelation. So here is just something that they are very much talking about. They also make reference that in other religions that are of antiquity, of the Egyptians and the Babylonians, there's also this idea of books being written and things that we learn about of our deeds being recorded in these books. So as we continue here, just unpacking some of this, the idea of what Daniel was seeing. We've talked about the thrones, and we want to look at this Ancient of Days. This, again, is so interesting and intriguing to me. We see that this Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was like snow, and then it talks about his hair being white like wool. So let's just take a look at this word for wool here, and it is the word in Aramaic called amar, which is very interesting to me because it is the same word for used for speech and for utterances. And here's what it basically says: to speak or to utter is the definition, but the meaning is wool. So right away, this causes just a lot of curiosity on my part as to how do they get a word that is normally associated with speech, as it's spoken of here, and how do they translate it as wool? And there is not a good explanation here. They say this word, as it's used in the Aramaic and translated as wool, is only used in this one time. Um, but again, what are we supposed to learn from this? We see the Ancient of Days. We know that he is a heavenly being, obviously is prominent center stage here. We could attribute this to God in a form that allows us to see him. Um, how does this work in a heavenly realm, in a spirit? Because we know that God is spirit, but yet we know he takes on forms, and they're called theophanies in religious speak, which are forms that God appears in for specific purposes. The Bible is filled with these theophanies of God appearing to people. Sometimes they describe him as a man, sometimes they describe him as an angel, sometimes there's no description really that the person who he was speaking to was even aware that this was God appearing to them until after the fact. So again, very fantastic, all of these images. But here we know that there's something different. His garment is white. We see in the story of the Transfiguration where Jesus appears. to be glowing in a white garment, like a very similar episode. I see a lot of similarities here. What I find interesting is that his hair was white, and his body was white. His clothes were white, and I always associate that with, as a person ages, that they become more complete. I know our society today is very anti-aging, and everything is based around youth and looking young and keeping yourself from aging. But yet, when I see here that this Ancient of Days was not inhibited in any way to allow himself to look mature, to allow himself to look in a way that's described as complete, that having white hair and was not looked down upon, but it was looked positively and embraced as someone who was wise, as someone who was in charge, someone who had the knowledge and was mature. And so I find that very interesting to show that very co- contra contradictory to our culture, or counterculture to where we are today. And so I think with that ending, we're going to just stop there. I just find it very, very interesting. The the other understanding of the wool, that when we unpack that, it gives the idea that the hair was somewhat unkept. All that goes through my mind is Albert Einstein's photos of his hair in a very unkept way. But the words here give that impression when we look it up in the Marcus Jastrows and looking up the ayin mem resh, it will also give that impression of wool and kind of standing up like wool does once it's combed and once it's extended. And so I will have that picture in my mind and trying to think about it and make sense of it and realize, why was that imagery important for God to appear like that? Why, what purpose did it have for him to present himself in such a way that that is what Daniel would relay to us? And what are we supposed to learn from this? Lots of questions, lots of thoughts to ponder. I hope you enjoy thinking about those things, and pray that you have a wonderful week and look forward to seeing you here next week. Bye bye.